Hi, I'm Kat Dobson. I'm an MSc student. I study behavioral and cognitive neurosciences at the University of Groningen. Today, I'm going to be talking about nitrous oxide. With interest in psychedelics, nitrous oxide might not be the first compound that usually comes to mind. It isn't a classic psychedelic compound in the sense of its mechanism of action, but it's an interesting gas, sometimes maybe misrepresented, and it may share some psychedelic-like effects. So I wanted to open my talk with this piece of art by Peter Max titled A Psychedelic Cloud. And nitrous oxide is a simple triatomic gas. It's present in our atmosphere, you're breathing it in right now in trace amounts. And in this talk, I want to give a bit more context to what nitrous oxide is, get into some history from its initial isolation to its development of use in medical settings and its recreational use, talk a little bit about the psychoactive effects that arise following inhalation, talk about its use in therapeutic settings versus how it could be used in research, and then talk about what kind of neurophysiological mechanisms underlie the psychoactive effects. And then, so why this interest in nitrous oxide? Why is it relevant to this current surge of interest in psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy? Can we use nitrous oxide to ask scientific questions about how the brain responds to psychoactive drugs? What kind of hypotheses can we build and experiments can we design to ask these questions? And what are the risks and benefits of using nitrous oxide? What other considerations are needed for this kind of research? So by the end, I hope that you'll all be a little bit more familiar with nitrous oxide, simple gas with an interesting function, and what we can learn from it and its administration in research settings. So our human history with nitrous oxide began over 200 years ago. The late 1700s, scientists were attempting to isolate different components of the atmosphere to see what kind of unique properties the separated gases might have. Joseph Priestley is credited with first isolating and recognizing nitrous oxide in 1772 with some of the contraptions like those seen here. He recalled it a remarkable species of air for its unique chemical properties. Shortly after, Humphrey Davy performed experiments with nitrous oxide, first in animals and then on himself. And sort of as Albert Hofmann to LSD, Davy was the first to report his experience inhaling nitrous oxide. And as the superintendent of a medical research facility in Bristol, Davy was interested and also took notice of the potential clinical applications of nitrous oxide, including the analgesic or the pain relieving properties. And the experiments that he conducted would lay groundwork for the introduction of nitrous oxide to medical use. And so nitrous oxide has been used in medical settings for over 150 years as a dissociative anesthetic, as an analgesic, as an anxiolytic, so for reducing anxiety, for example, in dental surgeries. And these effects emerge in a dose-dependent manner. So nitrous oxide is administered in mixture with oxygen, and with higher concentrations of nitrous oxide can lead to these anesthetic or sedative properties, while the lower subanesthetic doses are often used for analgesic, pain relieving properties, or to investigate the psychotropic properties. And Humphrey Davy also reported some of the more pleasurable effects that he experienced following inhalation of nitrous oxide. So Davy reported experiencing euphoria, giddiness, other interesting phenomena such that the objects around him would become more dazzling. And soon after, other Victorian gentlemen in his social circle were also enjoying the effects of nitrous oxide at laughing gas parties. Nitrous oxide fell into the hands of American psychologist and philosopher William James, who wrote of the mystical experiences that he had with nitrous oxide and other compounds that may have influenced some tenets of his philosophy. And the first public reference attributed to James regarding nitrous oxide and the revelatory insight it provided was published in 1874. Nitrous oxide remained popular from the laughing gas parties to the 1960s and 1970s, the psychedelic era. These are some quotes from a newspaper article in 1967. Some interviewed said that nitrous was a popular recreational drug because it could produce the same psychedelic effects as other drugs like LSD, but it was cheaper to obtain. And a student demonstrates this by his ability to obtain nitrous oxide under the guise of performing experiments in rats. And nitrous oxide may not have just been a fad, but 50 years later, continues to be a popular recreational drug referred to as NOS, NANGs, Whippets. And when used recreationally, it's sold in these metal canisters, which can be used to fill balloons. And the nitrous oxide is often inhaled from balloons. The depending on where you are, you may see some of these canisters on the street after a night out. So what are the effects of nitrous oxide make it such that people want to seek it out recreationally? The effects emerge very quickly upon inhalation and also wear off quickly. And to build an understanding of the effects, we can look at trip reports, descriptions from recreational use, look at research performed with healthy volunteers in lab settings. And it's important to note that the effects can be dependent on the environment and can vary between individual. So there may be experience of euphoria, happy mood, feeling like laughing. It's the term laughing gas. Some research subjects reported feeling like they can more readily see the comical side of things. There are also changes in perception, including sound distortions, illusions, hallucinations, mostly auditory in nature. One study, a subject reported hearing music drifting in from the building next door, an opera, maybe by Mozart, Beethoven, and the experiments cannot corroborate hearing any such thing. The effects of nitrous oxide have been described as a dreamy, detached reverie state. So the feeling of being in a daydream, that things are less real than usual. There may also be experiences of perceived insight, so flashes of understanding, the sense of making a discovery. Ideas may come together by free association in a way that may seem unrelated or irrelevant to external observers. There may be effects that are less comfortable or negative, such as perservations, which can be described as persevering or repetitive thoughts or behaviors, paranoid thought patterns, for example, thinking that undirected events are personally relevant. And finally, nitrous oxide is a dissociative. So there have been reported experiences of changes in sensation or changes in awareness of the body, feeling like one's floating, a sense of detachment or inhibited control of movement. So quite a wide range of effects. Some may seem psychedelic-like in nature, including changes in time perception or changes in the sense of self. And the effects can be dependent on environment as well. So with the resurging interest in psychedelic-assisted therapies, it could be worthy to note that some research has been done to look at whether nitrous oxide has any efficacy in psychiatric treatment. In clinical or research settings, nitrous oxide is administered through the mask as seen here, usually 50% of nitrous oxide or less with the remainder oxygen. And a number of studies as early as the 1980s have looked at the effects of nitrous oxide on alcohol withdrawal, some conflicting results as to whether this has had a significant effect. More recently, some studies have looked at the effect of nitrous oxide in major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Some early efficacy has been demonstrated, but it's important to note the small sample sizes with the number of patients and indicated here. So there's a great interest in the therapeutic efficacy of nitrous oxide, but I want to focus on another side of the research as well that has also been stagnated in the past 50 plus years of prohibition. And there's a lot of basic questions that we still have regarding psychoactive drug effects, not necessarily wanting to see whether it can help psychiatric symptoms, but just how it interacts with the brain. We have a lot that we need to understand. How can some simple molecules have these diverse effects and interact with an organ as complex as the brain? So we can ask questions on basic neuropharmacology with a lot of different drugs, and nitrous oxide might be beneficial to start this investigation for a few reasons. Namely, it has fewer restrictions on access, and in general, it has low barriers to access. So it's less regulated, and it doesn't seem to face the same strict regulations on possession as some other drugs like psilocybin or MDMA do. It's low cost. It has some advantages for designing experiments in research settings. For example, its rapid onset and offset of action. So the effects emerge soon after administration and they wear off very quickly within a few minutes of taking off the gas mask. And this makes the amount of time needed to have an experimental session much shorter than with other compounds, for example, like with LSD. Makes it easy to stop the drug effects if any adverse events emerge. So if any negative effects are being experienced, the acute effects of nitrous oxide can be removed quite rapidly. with this shorter onset and offset of action, we can also measure behavior before, during, and after drug administration within a shorter time frame. Its use is not limited to hospitals, so procedures have been developed for using nitrous oxide in private offices and dentistry practices, and these safety protocols can be adapted for use in research settings. And finally, it has an established safety profile, so there's some understanding of the potential risks and harms of nitrous oxide use from its long period of application in clinical settings. So some might still be wondering, is nitrous oxide really safe? Perhaps in part from media like this, terms like hippie crack. And the safety, and like any compound, there are risks associated with use, but through looking at reports of recreational drug users, for example, with the Global Drug Survey, many report past year or lifetime use of nitrous oxide, and of those few report serious adverse effects or any adverse effects associated with use. So there may be a low risk of adverse effects, and any of these risks, and especially the serious adverse effects, can be mitigated through precautions, whether through harm reduction efforts in recreational settings or through controlling experimental environments and research settings. So one serious risk that can be mitigated by control environments is hypoxia. So when there isn't enough oxygen reaching the brain tissues from displacement with nitrous oxide, and this can be mitigated by administering nitrous oxide in combination with oxygen. As mentioned, usually 50% or less nitrous oxide is used in subanesthetic doses, and the remainder oxygen. Another serious risk that has been reported is vitamin B12 deficiency, and this can also be mediated by use of nitrous oxide in controlled environments. With the vitamin B deficiency, B12, or the inactivation of vitamin B12 occurs with frequent use of nitrous oxide and repeated dosing. So in a lab environment, for example, less frequent use significantly lowers the risk of this deficiency. And there can be other complications associated with nitrous oxide use, for example, with its use with alcohol or other comorbid drug use, or use in individuals that have medical complications that may impart higher risk. So all of these can be controlled. All of these added risks can be controlled with adequate screening profiles for any kind of experimental interventions. So with some understanding of the safety and the risks, let's look further into what mediate these mechanisms of nitrous oxide. So the psychoactive effects of nitrous oxide are thought to be mediated primarily through NMDA receptor antagonism. What does that mean? In cell signaling neurons communicate by releasing neurotransmitters like glutamate. Glutamate travels from one neuron to the other across this synaptic space and binds to receptors at the receiving neuron that can then moderate activity of the downstream neuron. And so glutamate is one of the most abundant excitatory neurotransmitters. It's present in over 90% of synaptic connections, and it's responsible for a lot of signaling between cells. It helps neurons fire. It helps continue sending signals along these pathways. And so NMDA receptors receive glutamate. When they receive glutamate, they can open, they allow ions to flow through, and this continues the excitatory signaling downstream. And so when nitrous oxide is administered, it blocks these receptors from opening. Ions cannot travel through the receptor anymore, and that inhibits continual excitatory signaling. For context, we can think of other drugs that have similar effects like ketamine, and this NMDA receptor antagonism kind of inhibits some normal excitatory function, disrupts processes like perception and sensation as described earlier. So with some understanding of mechanisms from its initial receptor antagonism, that kind of just opens up more questions than it gives us answers. So for example, how do these effects at the cellular level, at the receptor level, translate to system level changes that we see, for example, in whole brain activity with EEG, and how do these changes relate to emergent behavior that's observed? Another question can be, how can such a simple molecule like nitrous oxide have such a diverse range of effects? And as questions for other psychedelic drugs, how can the acute subjective effects be related to the persisting therapeutic effects, or are they related at all? And some models have attempted to try to answer these questions. For example, how psychedelic drugs can have such a diverse effect on the brain. They point to different circuitry and structures. And for example, there are a few theories that consider the role of the thalamus, group of cell bodies that relay information from sensory organs to processing in the cortex, or theories that involve the claustrum, a thin strip of cells that integrate different sensory input from different sources, whether your eyes or from hearing, and bind them together to be associated with a common source. These models have mostly been developed in context of drug action at the 5-HT2A receptor. So this is the primary locus of action for drugs like psilocybin, LSD. Though some common mechanisms of action may be shared with drugs like nitrous oxide. Another hypothesis for psychedelic involves Bayesian inference. So our brain makes inferences about the world. We develop hypotheses of our understanding, and we make predictions about what we may see. So when we experience something, our predictions and sensory evidence are combined to update our future understanding. And so predictions and sensory evidence are both noisy. So represented here in these curves, you can see these probability distributions. Each of these curves can kind of represent a range of experience along the x-axis, the probability of it occurring on the y-axis. And so our experience of the world isn't just from sensory information alone, or the incoming evidence seen in red alone. We form hypotheses of what the world may be. We can compare these hypotheses to the incoming evidence. So compare the red to the blue, and the outcome is our updated hypotheses or understanding that's seen in pink. And it's more efficient to work with our understanding our prior experiences and our expectations. But what can happen when we put more weight into either our prior experiences or onto sensory experiences? It can shift how our updated understanding continues to kind of evolve. So on the left side, you can see there's more certainty on the prior predictions. There's more emphasis on prior experience. And then you can see that the beliefs don't update as ready with the incoming evidence that is given in red. And this could reflect kind of these rigid states that may be seen in psychiatric disorders, where former beliefs are more rigid, less readily updated, kind of stuck in the same pattern of maladaptive thinking. And on the right side, there's a hypothesis put forward by Carhart, Harris, and Friston that prior beliefs are relaxed under psychedelics. So there's a relaxing that allows for incoming evidence to have more weight and update future hypotheses. So again, these models are built were built with a desire to understand the effects of 5-HT2A agonist psychedelics. And we can see that nitrous oxide may share some of these effects. To look deeper, we can look at the concept of prediction error or surprise. And that's the difference between what we initially believed to be occurring and how our beliefs are later updated. So this can be thought of a measure of surprise. And NMDA receptor antagonists like ketamine have been shown to have changes in prediction error signaling and in learning. And we can start to develop some kind of hypotheses of how nitrous oxide may interact in these models of psychedelic that were built initially for psychedelic, but may be shared by nitrous oxide to understand some more basic mechanisms of how drugs interact with the brain. So some considerations are needed in developing these types of research programs or experiments. There are benefits for nitrous oxide. Again, with the rapid onset and offset, we can look at acute drug effects. We can manipulate behavior during acute drug effects and see how that is able to be see what changes can arise in the persisting effects. We can also look at global versus local changes. There are some ethical considerations that also need to be considered. For example, what are the scientific benefits? What are we learning? And does that outweigh any risks to individuals? And individual risks will differ. Individuals should be giving informed consent. Also, there's need to improve scientific rigor in experimentation. For example, with other psychedelic drugs, there are issues of treatment blinding. Participants don't know whether they're receiving the active or the placebo. And there's a need to ensure that we're measuring the right behavior. For example, if you want to look at a learning paradigm, nitrous oxide can also have effects on motor control or memory. So it's important to assure that those changes can be controlled for when you don't want to measure, for example, motor control. So thank you for your time. I hope that you're a bit more familiar with nitrous oxide. I hope that you might be thinking of how nitrous oxide could be used to investigate its effects on behavior and brain function. And I hope that there is continued evaluation of how experiments can be built with scientific rigor and with keeping safety in mind. Thank you.